Have you ever been in a situation where someone looked at you and decided, based on your appearance or your job, that you couldn't possibly be intelligent, where someone made assumptions about your capabilities before you even had a chance to prove yourself? Well, what you're about to hear is the story of a woman who faced exactly that kind of prejudice and turned it into the most spectacular comeback you can imagine. This is the story of Ellie Parker, a cleaning lady working the early morning shift at one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. Every day she mopped floors and emptied trash cans in offices where lawyers made more money in an hour than she made in a month. But what nobody knew, what nobody bothered to find out, was that Ellie was secretly studying international law, fluent in legal French, and more brilliant than most of the attorneys, walking those polished marble hallways in their $1,000 suits. Alexander Hunt was the kind of man who'd built his empire on being smarter than everyone else in the room. CEO of Blackstone and Associates, legal prodigy, someone who'd never lost a case and definitely never acknowledged that a person beneath his station might have something valuable to offer, until the morning he caught the cleaning lady reading his confidential French legal documents. What happened next wasn't just humiliation. It was a complete reversal of everything. Both of them thought they knew about intelligence, worth, and what it really means to earn respect in this world. Because sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who ends up changing your life forever. This isn't just another underdog story. This is about what happens when talent meets opportunity, when prejudice collides with brilliance, and when two people from completely different worlds discover that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, one difficult choice at a time. So buckle up, because you're about to witness a transformation that proves intelligence doesn't care about your background. Success doesn't always look the way you expect, and sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody sees coming. Picture this. It's 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Manhattan, and while most people are rushing to their corner coffee shops, grabbing their usual lattes and scrolling through their phones, Ellie Parker is already 3 hours into her workday. She's not sitting in some fancy office chair with a view of Central Park, though. She's on her hands and knees scrubbing the pristine marble floors of Blackstone and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. But here's what nobody knows about Ellie. While she's cleaning those floors, her mind is racing through complex legal concepts she studied the night before. International law, contract disputes, maritime regulations, constitutional amendments. You see, Ellie isn't just a janitor who happens to clean a law firm. She's a brilliant law student who's been forced to put her dreams on hold, working multiple jobs just to keep her head above water. Every single morning, she cleans the same offices where partners make more in an hour than she makes in a month. She dusts the same law books she wishes she could afford, runs her fingers along leather-bound volumes that cost more than her rent, and she empties the trash cans filled with legal briefs that she could probably write better than half the attorneys strutting around that building in their $1,000 suits. That particular Tuesday started like any other ordinary day, until Ellie found herself alone in the executive conference room where the firm's CEO, Alexander Hunt, had left his papers scattered across the mahogany table. Alexander wasn't just any CEO. He was a legal prodigy who'd built his reputation on being ruthless, brilliant, and completely untouchable. The man who'd never lost a case, never shown weakness, and definitely never acknowledged that someone beneath his station might have something valuable to offer. As Ellie cleaned around his workspace, carefully organizing papers and wiping down surfaces, she couldn't help but notice the French legal document spread across the table. Her eyes lit up like someone had just turned on a switch in her brain. You see, what Alexander didn't know, what nobody in that entire firm knew, was that Ellie had been secretly studying international law with a specialized focus on French legal systems. While other students struggled with basic concepts and complained about homework, Ellie was fluent in legal French, spending her nights translating complex documents for practice. She was so completely absorbed in reading the contract, her mind automatically processing the intricate legal terminology, that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching down the marble hallway. Fascinating reading material for a cleaning lady, don't you think? Alexander's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade through silk. Ellie spun around, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs, finding herself face to face with the man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. Alexander Hunt stood there in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his steel gray eyes taking in every single detail of the scene before him. Here was this janitor, supposedly just doing her menial job, caught red-handed studying his highly confidential legal documents. Most people would have apologized profusely and scurried away like frightened mice. But something in Ellie's eyes, a spark of intelligence, maybe even defiance, told him she wasn't most people. "I was just cleaning around your papers." "Sir?" Ellie said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. But Alexander wasn't buying it for a second. He'd seen the way she was reading that document, not skimming mindlessly, not glancing casually, but actually studying it with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely understood what they were looking at. "You know what?" Alexander said, a cruel smile slowly spreading across his perfectly sculpted face. "Since you seem so incredibly interested in legal work, why don't we put that curiosity to the test?" He reached out and grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with enough authority to make his point crystal clear. "You're coming with me, right now." And that's how Ellie found herself being dragged into the firm's main conference room, where Alexander was about to hold a high-stakes meeting with international clients worth millions of dollars. The room fell completely silent as Alexander walked in with the cleaning lady in tow. Senior partners adjusted their wire-rimmed glasses nervously. Junior associates whispered among themselves in confusion, and the bewildered clients looked around trying to understand what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander announced with theatrical flair that would have made Broadway actors jealous, "I'd like you to meet our newest legal consultant." The sarcasm dripped from every single word like poison honey. Ellie here was just showing tremendous interest in our French contract, so I thought she might help us with a little translation challenge. The humiliation was supposed to be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating. Alexander grabbed the most complex legal document from the table. A merger agreement worth $50 million, written entirely in archaic French legal terminology that would challenge even the most experienced international lawyers with decades of practice. "Go ahead, Ellie," he said, sliding the thick document across the polished table with a satisfied smirk. "Since you're so fascinated by legal work, why don't you translate this for our distinguished clients? I'm sure they'd absolutely love to hear what our cleaning staff thinks about international contract law." The days following that conference room incident should have been the end of the story. Alexander Hunt should have forgotten about the cleaning lady who'd embarrassed him in front of his most important clients. Should have moved on to bigger deals, more prestigious cases, anything other than thinking about Ellie Parker. But that's not what happened. Instead, Alexander found himself lying awake at night replaying that moment over and over. Not the humiliation, though that stung more than he cared to admit, but the way Ellie had handled herself. The quiet confidence, the perfect translation, that moment when she'd caught an error that could have cost his firm everything. It gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. So Alexander did what any obsessive control freak CEO would do. He decided to investigate. Not through official channels, of course, that would have been too obvious. Instead, he used his connections, called in favors, and within 48 hours he had Ellie Parker's entire life story spread across his mahogany desk. What he found wasn't what he expected. At all. Ellie wasn't some random person who'd stumbled into legal knowledge. She was a straight-A student who'd been accepted to NYU Law School on a full scholarship. Not just any scholarship, the kind they give to maybe 5 students per year, the ones they expect to become Supreme Court justices or run major corporations. But here's where the story gets interesting. Ellie had turned down a full ride to one of the most prestigious law schools in the country, and Alexander couldn't understand why anyone would make such an apparently stupid decision until he dug deeper. That's when he discovered Marie Parker, Ellie's mother. Stage 4 cancer, experimental treatments, medical bills that would have bankrupted most middle-class families. Ellie hadn't just turned down NYU, she'd sacrificed her entire future to become her mother's full-time caregiver and financial provider. Alexander stared at that medical report for a long time. Something about it felt familiar, like looking into a mirror he hadn't used in years. You see, Alexander Hunt hadn't always been the cold, calculating CEO everyone feared. Once upon a time, he'd been a kid from the wrong side of Brooklyn, sleeping on friends' couches, working 3 jobs just to afford community college textbooks. He remembered nights when he'd chosen between buying dinner or photocopying law books at the library. Remembered the humiliation of wearing the same worn-out suit to every job interview because it was the only one he owned. Remembered the professors who'd looked at him like he didn't belong, the classmates who'd made jokes about his accent, his background, his obvious lack of money. But somewhere along the way, Alexander had forgotten that kid. Success had a funny way of erasing memories, of making you believe you'd always been destined for greatness. The hungry, desperate young man who'd clawed his way to the top had been replaced by someone who'd never known struggle, never faced real adversity. Looking at Ellie's file, Alexander realized he was staring at his own story, except she was still living it, still fighting battles he'd forgotten he'd ever faced. The difference was that Ellie had made choices Alexander never would have made. She'd chosen family over ambition, love over success, sacrifice over self-interest. This revelation should have softened him, should have made him want to help. Instead, it made him angry. Not at Ellie, at himself, at the system, at the unfairness of watching someone so brilliant waste their potential on circumstances beyond their control. That anger drove him to do something completely out of character. Alexander Hunt, who never lowered himself to deal with employees below senior partner level, decided to confront Ellie directly. He found her in the HR department, sitting across from Janet Morrison discussing her work schedule. "Ms. Parker," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the conversation like a knife. "I need to speak with you now." Janet Morrison practically jumped out of her chair. "You have to understand, Alexander Hunt didn't just drop by HR for casual conversations. When the CEO appeared anywhere unexpectedly, people assumed someone was getting fired or the building was on fire." Ellie turned around slowly, her dark eyes meeting Alexander's without flinching. She didn't look surprised to see him, didn't look intimidated by his presence. If anything, she looked tired. Not physically tired, though she probably was. Working multiple jobs, but tired in a way that comes from carrying burdens too heavy for your shoulders. "Mr. Hunt," she said simply, standing up with the kind of dignity that can't be taught or bought, "how can I help you?" Alexander had prepared a speech. Something about recognizing talent, about opportunities and potential, but standing there looking at this woman who'd outmaneuvered him in front of his most important clients. All his prepared words seemed inadequate. "I know about NYU," he said instead, his voice lower than usual. "I know about the scholarship you turned down." For the first time since he'd known her, Ellie's composure cracked slightly. Just for a second. But Alexander caught it. The flash of pain, of dreams deferred, of choices that cost more than anyone should have to pay. "That's ancient history, Mr. Hunt," Ellie replied. But Alexander wasn't letting this go. "I'm offering you an unpaid internship," he said, the words coming out more bluntly than he'd intended. "Legal department. You'd work with our international contracts team." The silence in that HR office was deafening. Janet Morrison looked like she was witnessing something supernatural. The CEO of Blackstone and Associates offering an internship to their cleaning lady. It was the kind of story people would tell for years, except nobody would believe it actually happened. But Ellie's response wasn't gratitude. It wasn't excitement or relief or any of the reactions Alexander had expected. Instead, she looked at him with something that might have been disappointment. "An unpaid internship," she repeated, her voice flat. "How generous." The sarcasm hit Alexander like a slap across the face. He realized in that moment exactly how his offer sounded. Here was a woman working multiple jobs to pay for her mother's cancer treatment, and he was offering her the opportunity to work for free. "Ellie, I'm trying to help you," Alexander said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were wrong. "No, Mr. Hunt," Ellie replied, gathering her things with deliberate calm. "You're trying to make yourself feel better about what happened in that conference room. But charity disguised as opportunity is still charity, and I don't need your pity." And with that, she walked out of the HR office, leaving Alexander standing there with his unpaid internship offer, and the growing realization that he'd completely misunderstood everything about the woman who'd managed to see right through him. You'd think that after being rejected so definitively, Alexander Hunt would have moved on. You'd think a man with his ego would have written off Ellie Parker as just another ungrateful employee who didn't recognize opportunity when it knocked. But that's not what happened. Instead, Alexander found himself more intrigued than ever, watching from the shadows as Ellie continued to navigate her impossible schedule with the kind of determination that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with law in the first place. Ellie's days were a masterclass in time management that would have impressed the most efficient CEOs. She'd finish her cleaning shift at Blackstone and Associates by 9 a.m., then rush across town to her second job at a small accounting firm. By 2 p.m., she was at the hospital, spelling her Mother's Day nurse and spending precious hours with Marie before heading to her evening classes at the community college, where she was slowly, methodically working toward her law degree. Most people would have cracked under that pressure. Most people would have given up on their dreams, settled for stability, accepted that life sometimes doesn't work out the way you planned. But Ellie wasn't most people. Even exhausted, even struggling to pay bills that seemed to multiply faster than she could earn money, she never stopped studying. Never stopped believing that someday, somehow she'd find a way to become the lawyer she'd always dreamed of being. What Ellie didn't know was that Alexander had started paying attention to her schedule. Not in a creepy stalker way. He told himself it was professional interest, a CEO monitoring a potentially valuable employee. But the truth was more complicated. Watching Ellie work with such dedication while dealing with circumstances that would have destroyed lesser people made Alexander question everything he thought he knew about success, about privilege, about what it really meant to earn your place in the world. That's why he was in the office so early that Thursday morning when everything changed again. Alexander was reviewing contracts in his corner office when he heard voices drifting from the conference room down the hall. Normally, he wouldn't have paid attention. Senior associates often held early meetings, but something about the tone made him pause. Mr. Grayson, one of the firm's most respected senior partners, was presenting a contract analysis to potential clients. Alexander recognized the voices. Representatives from a major European corporation looking to establish manufacturing operations in the United States. The deal was worth close to $80 million, the kind of contract that could make or break the firm's quarterly numbers. Alexander was about to return to his own work when he heard Grayson stumble over a particular clause. Something about liability limitations in the French portion of the contract. Alexander frowned, pulled up the digital version on his computer and started following along with Grayson's presentation. That's when he realized the senior partner was making a catastrophic error. Grayson was interpreting a critical clause about environmental responsibility as optional compliance, when the French text clearly mandated strict adherence to EU standards. It was the kind of mistake that could result in millions of dollars in fines, potential criminal liability for the clients, and a lawsuit that would destroy Blackstone and Associates' reputation. Alexander was halfway to the conference room when his computer chimed with a new email notification. The message was from an internal account he didn't immediately recognize. Parker BlackstoneAssociates.com. Ellie's work email address. The subject line read, "Urgent. Contract translation error in Grayson presentation." Alexander opened the email and found a detailed, professionally written analysis of exactly the same problem he'd just identified. But Ellie's breakdown was more thorough than his own, including references to specific EU regulations, precedent cases, and potential legal ramifications that even Alexander hadn't immediately considered. The email was time-stamped just 3 minutes earlier, which meant Ellie had been cleaning the conference room, had overheard Grayson's presentation, had identified the error faster than Alexander himself, and had written a comprehensive legal analysis in less time than it took most lawyers to compose a simple response. Alexander stared at his computer screen for a long moment, processing what he was looking at. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was raw, undeniable legal talent operating at a level that most of his highly paid associates couldn't match on their best days. He forwarded Ellie's analysis to his phone and walked straight into the conference room where Grayson was still presenting his flawed interpretation to increasingly concerned-looking clients. "Excuse me, Richard," Alexander said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room immediately pay attention. "I need to clarify something about Section 12 of the Environmental Compliance Clause." What followed was 15 minutes of the most impressive legal maneuvering the clients had probably ever witnessed. Alexander smoothly corrected Grayson's interpretation, explained the actual requirements, and restructured the entire deal in a way that not only protected the clients from liability, but actually saved them millions in potential regulatory costs. The clients were impressed. Grayson was confused but grateful. And Alexander was looking at an $80 million deal that had just been saved by a woman who was supposed to be emptying trash cans, not providing high-level legal analysis. After the meeting ended and the clients left with smiles and handshakes, Alexander found himself standing in his office staring out at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about talent and opportunity, and the kind of systemic unfairness that kept brilliant people trapped in circumstances beneath their abilities. That's when he made a decision that would change everything, not just for Ellie, but for his entire firm and dozens of other talented people who'd never been given the chance they deserved. Alexander called an emergency meeting with the firm's senior partners. Within 2 hours, he'd presented a proposal that left half the room speechless and the other half questioning whether their CEO had lost his mind. The Blackstone Legal Fellows Program would identify and recruit exceptional legal talent from non-traditional backgrounds, not unpaid interns or charity cases, but fully compensated positions with mentorship, educational support, and a clear path to associate-level positions for those who prove themselves. The program would be merit-based, rigorous, and designed to find people like Ellie Parker, brilliant minds trapped by circumstances but capable of extraordinary things when given the right opportunity. And the first fellow? That position would be offered to the woman who'd just saved them $80 million while she was supposed to be cleaning floors. 3 days later, Alexander stood outside the small Queens apartment where Ellie lived with her mother, holding an offer letter that would change her life. But he had no idea that convincing Ellie Parker to accept this opportunity would prove to be the hardest negotiation of his entire career. You know how sometimes when things are finally going well, life decides to remind you that happiness is fragile? That's exactly what happened to Ellie Parker 3 weeks after she accepted the position as Blackstone & Associates' first legal fellow. 3 weeks of feeling like maybe, just maybe, her dreams were finally within reach. 3 weeks of walking into that prestigious law firm not as the cleaning lady, but as someone who belonged there. But dreams have a funny way of attracting enemies, and Ellie was about to discover that not everyone was thrilled about her remarkable transformation. From janitor to legal fellow, Sophia Langford was the kind of woman who commanded attention the moment she walked into any room. Senior associate, Harvard Law graduate, perfectly styled blonde hair that probably cost more to maintain than most people's monthly rent. She was also Alexander Hunt's ex-fiancée, a detail that made every conversation in the office hallways infinitely more complicated. Sophia had watched Alexander's sudden interest in the cleaning lady with the kind of cold calculation that made her such a formidable attorney. She'd seen the way he looked at Ellie during that infamous translation incident, noticed how he'd personally championed the Legal Fellows program, observed the careful attention he paid to Ellie's progress, and Sophia Langford didn't like being replaced by anyone, especially not by someone she considered beneath her station. The whisper campaign started small. Casual comments during coffee breaks about how the firm's standards were changing, pointed questions about whether merit-based hiring was really merit-based when the CEO had obvious personal interests, snide remarks about cleaning ladies playing dress-up in the legal department. But Sophia was too smart to lead these attacks directly. Instead, she cultivated them, nurtured them, let other people say what she was thinking while maintaining plausible deniability. She was like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of workplace toxicity, and Ellie was the target. Ellie tried to ignore it at first. She'd dealt with discrimination before, as a scholarship kid in college, as a woman in male-dominated spaces, as someone whose work uniform had once been a mop and cleaning supplies. She thought she could handle a few jealous colleagues making snide comments about her background. What she wasn't prepared for was how systematically the campaign against her would escalate. Important meetings would be scheduled without notifying her. Legal research assignments would mysteriously disappear from her desk. Colleagues would stop mid-conversation when she approached, creating an atmosphere of isolation that made every workday feel like walking through hostile territory. The breaking point came during a team meeting about the Morrison Industries merger, a complex international deal that Ellie had been researching for 2 weeks. She'd prepared a comprehensive analysis of the French regulatory requirements, the same kind of detailed work that had saved the firm millions on previous contracts. Sophia waited until Ellie was halfway through her presentation before striking. "I'm sorry," Sophia interrupted, her voice carrying just the right tone of professional concern. But shouldn't we double-check this analysis? I mean, no offense to our legal fellow program, but this is an $80 million deal. Maybe we should have someone with actual legal experience review this work before we present it to the clients. The room went dead silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming, papers rustling nervously, someone's pen clicking in the background. Every person in that conference room understood exactly what Sophia was saying without saying it directly. Mr. Grayson, still grateful for how Ellie had saved his presentation weeks earlier, tried to defend her work. Actually, Sophia, Ellie's research has been exceptional. Her analysis of the environmental compliance issues alone saved us from potential regulatory nightmares. But Sophia wasn't finished. Of course, Richard. I'm sure her cleaning experience gives her unique insights into compliance issues. The pause before cleaning experience lasted just long enough to make sure everyone caught the insult. Ellie felt her face burning with humiliation, but she forced herself to maintain professional composure. My analysis is based on current EU regulations and precedent cases from the past 18 months. I can provide additional documentation if needed. That won't be necessary, Sophia replied with a smile that never reached her eyes. I think it would be best if you focused on more appropriate tasks while the senior associates handle the complex legal work. What happened next was the kind of bureaucratic humiliation that destroys people's spirits more effectively than outright cruelty. Within an hour, Ellie found herself reassigned from the Morrison Industries project to general facility support duties, which was corporate speak for cleaning the basement storage rooms, where old files went to die. So there was Ellie Parker, the brilliant legal mind who'd saved the firm millions of dollars, back on her hands and knees scrubbing floors in the basement while colleagues she'd outperformed were handling cases she should have been working on. The basement wasn't just physically isolating, it was emotionally devastating. Down there, surrounded by boxes of abandoned legal files and broken office furniture, Ellie couldn't pretend she belonged in the world upstairs. She couldn't maintain the fiction that merit mattered more than politics, that talent would eventually win over prejudice. That's when her phone rang with the call that shattered what was left of her composure. Miss Parker, this is Dr. Matthews from Mount Sinai Hospital. I'm calling about your mother's condition. The doctor's voice was gentle but direct, the way medical professionals learn to deliver bad news. Marie's cancer has progressed faster than we anticipated. We need to start an aggressive treatment protocol immediately, but I have to be honest about the costs involved. $20,000. That's what it would take to give her mother a fighting chance. $20,000 that Ellie didn't have, couldn't borrow, and wouldn't be able to earn in time to matter. Sitting in that basement, still wearing her legal fellow badge like some kind of cruel joke, Ellie made the hardest decision of her life. She pulled out her phone and typed a resignation email to Alexander Hunt, effective immediately. She didn't explain about her mother's condition, didn't mention Sophia's campaign of humiliation, didn't ask for help or pity or understanding. She simply resigned from the Legal Fellows program and walked out of Blackstone and Associates for what she thought would be the last time. But Ellie had underestimated how closely Alexander had been watching everything that happened to her. And she had no idea that he was about to drive through the worst thunderstorm New York had seen in years to reach her apartment in Queens, carrying with him the kind of conversation that would force both of them to confront truths they weren't ready to face. Picture this. It's 11 p.m. on a Thursday night in Queens, and the rain is hitting Ellie's apartment window like bullets against glass. She's sitting at her small kitchen table staring at a resignation letter she can't bring herself to send, when she hears someone pounding on her door, not knocking, pounding, like whoever's out there is desperate to get inside. Ellie opens the door to find Alexander Hunt standing in her hallway, completely soaked from the thunderstorm, his usually perfect hair plastered to his forehead, his expensive suit dripping water onto her worn carpet. He looks nothing like the composed, intimidating CEO she knew from the office. He looks human. "We need to talk," Alexander says, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. But Ellie's not in the mood for corporate speeches or damage control. "There's nothing to talk about, Mr. Hunt. I quit." End of story. Alexander pushes past her into the apartment, not aggressively, but with the kind of determination that comes from driving across the city in a storm, because you can't live with yourself if you don't. He's carrying an envelope in his hand, and he sets it on her kitchen table like it contains the answer to everything. $20,000, he says simply, for your mother's treatment. Ellie stares at the envelope like it might explode. I told you before, I don't want your charity. It's not charity, Alexander replies, and there's something in his voice that makes Ellie actually look at him. It's an apology. For failing you, for not protecting you from what happened, for being so blind to office politics that I let Sophia destroy something that could have been extraordinary. That's when Alexander does something completely unexpected. He sits down at Ellie's small kitchen table and pulls out a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. Not typed, not formal, handwritten in his own messy scrawl. Before you say anything, Alexander continues, just read this, please. The letter isn't what Ellie expected. It's not a business proposal or a legal document. It's personal, vulnerable, and completely honest in a way that successful people rarely allow themselves to be. Alexander writes about growing up in Brooklyn, about nights when he had to choose between buying food and photocopying textbook pages at the library, about professors who looked at him like he didn't belong, classmates who made jokes about his background, his accent, his obvious poverty, about working construction during the day and studying law at night, falling asleep over casebooks because he was too exhausted to process another sentence. But then the letter takes a darker turn. Alexander writes about how success changed him, how each promotion and partnership made him forget where he came from, how he became the kind of person who would have dismissed his younger self, who would have seen a cleaning lady studying legal documents and assumed she was overstepping her bounds rather than demonstrating extraordinary talent. You reminded me of why I became a lawyer in the first place, Alexander writes, not for the money or the prestige or the power, but because the law is supposed to be the one place where truth matters more than background, where intelligence matters more than connections, where justice isn't reserved for people who can afford it. The letter goes on for 3 pages, and by the time Ellie finishes reading, she realizes she's crying. Not because of the money, though $20,000 would change everything for her mother, but because someone finally understood. Someone finally saw her not as a charity case or an inspiring story, but as a person whose dreams mattered, whose talent deserved recognition, whose struggle wasn't just background noise in someone else's success story. I can't accept this, Ellie says, but her voice lacks conviction. Then don't, Alexander replies, but don't let your pride destroy your mother's chance at recovery. And don't let Sophia Langford's jealousy destroy your chance at becoming the lawyer you're meant to be. That envelope sits on Ellie's kitchen table for 3 days. 3 days of watching her mother grow weaker. 3 days of job searching with no success. 3 days of wondering if she's making the biggest mistake of her life by walking away from everything she'd worked toward. On the 4th day, Ellie makes a decision that surprises everyone, including herself. She doesn't go back to Blackstone and Associates. She doesn't call Alexander. Instead, she shows up at the Queen's Housing Court as a volunteer legal advocate, offering to help tenants facing eviction proceedings. The case that changes everything involves the Martinez family, immigrants who'd been living in their apartment for 8 years before a new landlord decided he could make more money by forcing out long-term tenants and raising rents. The eviction notice was written in English. The legal proceedings were conducted in technical language the family couldn't understand, and their court-appointed advocate was overwhelmed with dozens of similar cases. Ellie Parker walks into that courtroom with nothing but her legal knowledge, her fluency in Spanish and her absolute refusal to let another family be destroyed by a system designed to favor people with money over people with rights. What happens next is the kind of legal argument that law students will study for years to come. Ellie doesn't just defend the Martinez family, she systematically dismantles the landlord's case, exposing procedural violations, challenging improper documentation, and citing housing regulations that the opposing attorney clearly hadn't bothered to research. The judge, initially skeptical about this young woman who'd appeared out of nowhere to represent tenants in a routine eviction case, finds himself leaning forward in fascination as Ellie presents her argument. This isn't just competent legal work. This is brilliant advocacy delivered with passion and precision. But Ellie doesn't know that Alexander Hunt is sitting in the back of that courtroom, having heard through his network about the extraordinary volunteer attorney who'd been making waves in housing court. He watches her work with something that feels like pride, like vindication, like falling in love with the law all over again. The Martinez family keeps their apartment. The landlord's attorney leaves shaking his head in disbelief. And Ellie Parker walks out of that courtroom knowing she's found her calling. Not in corporate law or prestigious firms, but in fighting for people who need someone to believe their struggles matter. That night, her phone rings. It's her mother's doctor with news that changes everything. An anonymous benefactor has paid all of Marie's medical bills, ensuring she'll receive the treatment she needs without any financial burden on the family. Ellie stares at her phone, knowing exactly who that anonymous benefactor must be, and for the first time since this whole journey began, she allows herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there are people in the world who understand that true power comes not from what you can take, but from what you choose to give. 2 years. That's how long it took for Ellie Parker to transform from a cleaning lady with impossible dreams into a licensed attorney with a reputation that preceded her into every courtroom in Queens. 2 years of studying while working pro bono cases, 2 years of proving that talent doesn't care about your background, and 2 years of Alexander Hunt watching from a distance as the woman who'd changed his entire perspective on justice became exactly the lawyer he'd always hoped she could be. But here's what nobody expected. Not even Ellie herself. Success didn't change her the way it had changed Alexander all those years ago. Instead of moving to a prestigious firm or chasing corporate clients with deep pockets, Ellie opened a small practice focused entirely on housing law, immigration cases, and employment disputes. The kind of law that doesn't make you rich but makes you sleep well at night. The Blackstone Legal Fellows program had grown into something extraordinary under Alexander's leadership. What started as a way to find one brilliant cleaning lady had evolved into a pipeline that identified exceptional legal talent from community colleges, night schools, and unconventional backgrounds. Dozens of people who'd never dreamed of working in major law firms were now associates, partners, and advocates changing the legal landscape across the city. But Alexander himself had changed too. The ruthless, arrogant CEO who'd once humiliated Ellie in front of clients had become someone who understood that true success isn't measured by how much you can take, but by how much you can give. He'd started dedicating half his firm's resources to pro bono work, personally mentoring legal fellows, and using his influence to support legal aid organizations across New York. People noticed. The legal community started calling Alexander Hunt a different kind of leader, someone who'd figured out how to be successful without sacrificing his humanity. But Alexander knew the truth. He hadn't figured out anything. He'd just been lucky enough to meet someone who reminded him who he used to be and who he wanted to become. That's why, on a Tuesday morning in October, Alexander Hunt found himself standing outside Ellie's small law office in Queens, holding something that wasn't a business proposal or a legal document. It was a contract, but not the kind you'd expect from one of Manhattan's most powerful attorneys. Ellie looked up from her desk when Alexander walked in, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. 2 years of occasional phone calls, professional, collaboration on Legal Fellows Program cases, and careful maintenance of appropriate boundaries. 2 years of unspoken recognition that whatever existed between them was complicated by their history, their different worlds, and the kind of professional relationship that didn't easily transform into something personal. "You know," Alexander said, settling into the worn chair across from her desk, "I've been thinking about contracts lately, specifically about how the most important agreements in life are the ones we make with people, not corporations." Ellie raised an eyebrow, the same expression she'd worn that first day when he'd tried to humiliate her with a French translation. "Is this your way of offering me a job again? Because I told you I'm happy where I am." Alexander smiled, and it was the kind of genuine smile that people rarely saw from him. "Actually, I was thinking about offering you something else entirely." He placed a single sheet of paper on her desk, handwritten in his familiar scrawl. "A contract for the future," the document was titled. And what followed wasn't legal language about obligations and considerations and termination clauses. It was Alexander Hunt, successful attorney and CEO, asking Ellie Parker, brilliant advocate and the woman who'd changed his life, to marry him. But this wasn't some romantic gesture designed to sweep her off her feet. It was a proposal written in the language they both understood best: law. Alexander had drafted their potential marriage as a partnership agreement between equals, complete, with shared goals, mutual respect, and a commitment to using their combined talents to make the legal system more just. Article 1, Ellie read aloud, trying not to smile. Both parties agree that love should be demonstrated through action, not just words, particularly through dedication to justice and service to those who need legal advocacy most. Article E. 2, she continued, states that both parties will maintain their individual professional identities and support each other's career goals without expectation of sacrifice or compromise of personal values. Alexander watched her read, his heart beating faster than it had during any high-stakes negotiation. Article 3 is my favorite, he said quietly. Ellie found Article 3 and felt her composure crack slightly. Both parties promised to remember that their love story began with a cleaning lady proving that intelligence doesn't depend on circumstances, and a CEO learning that true power comes from lifting others up, not keeping them down. The contract went on for 2 pages, covering everything from their shared commitment to expanding the Legal Fellows Program to their promise to raise any future children with an understanding that privilege is responsibility, not entitlement. At the bottom, instead of signature lines, Alexander had written, "This contract becomes binding when both parties agree that they've found someone worth building a life with, someone who makes them want to be better than they were yesterday." Ellie set the contract down and looked at Alexander for a long moment. "This is either the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me, or the most legally binding marriage proposal in history." "Why can't it be both?" Alexander replied. 6 months later, they were married in a courthouse in Queens, the same courthouse where Ellie had won her first case as a volunteer advocate, the same building where she'd discovered that fighting for justice was more important than fighting for status. Judge Martinez, whose family Ellie had saved from eviction, performed the ceremony. The wedding was small, simple, and absolutely perfect. Ellie Parker, healthy and cancer-free thanks to her early treatment, served as Ellie's matron of honor. The legal fellows from Blackstone and Associates attended as witnesses, and instead of traditional vows, Alexander and Ellie signed their contract for the future in front of everyone, making it legally binding in the most meaningful way possible. Their first dance wasn't to some romantic ballad. Instead, they swayed to the sound of the city outside, sirens and traffic and the constant hum of millions of people pursuing their dreams, making their own contracts with the future, proving every day that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. And as they held each other in that courthouse, surrounded by people whose lives they'd touched and who'd touched theirs in return, both Alexander and Ellie knew they'd created something that would last far beyond any legal document, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the unshakable belief that love and justice aren't just ideals to aspire to, but promises to keep. And that's how a cleaning lady became not just a lawyer, but a partner in life and justice with the man who once tried to humiliate her. But here's the real question. What does this story teach us about the world we're living in right now? Ellie Parker's journey wasn't just about proving herself to Alexander Hunt or getting revenge on people who underestimated her. It was about something much deeper. The courage to keep believing in yourself when everyone else has written you off. The strength to maintain your dignity when people try to tear it down. The wisdom to recognize that true power comes not from putting others down, but from lifting them up. How many times have you been in a room where someone dismissed your ideas before you even finished speaking? How many times have you felt invisible because of your background, your appearance, or your circumstances? How many times have you let other people's limitations become your own? Here's what I want you to understand. Ellie Parker wasn't extraordinary because she was smarter than everyone else. She was extraordinary because she refused to let other people's opinions define her reality. She didn't wait for permission to be brilliant. She didn't apologize for knowing more than people expected her to know. And she never ever let circumstances convince her to abandon her dreams. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people in Ellie's situation would have given up. Most people would have accepted that life isn't fair and settled for whatever scraps they could get. Most people would have let humiliation turn into resignation. Let setbacks turn into surrender. So I'm asking you directly, which person are you? Are you someone who uses obstacles as excuses? or someone who uses them as fuel? Are you waiting for the perfect moment to pursue your dreams, or are you creating opportunities right now, today, with whatever resources you have? Because the difference between Ellie Parker and everyone else wasn't luck or connections or even talent. It was the decision to keep fighting when fighting seemed pointless, to keep learning when learning seemed useless, to keep believing when believing seemed foolish. Your circumstances don't define your potential. Your background doesn't determine your future, and other people's inability to see your worth doesn't make you worthless. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Are you going to let this story inspire you for 5 minutes and then go back to your old patterns? Or are you going to make the decision, right now, today, to start treating yourself like someone whose dreams actually matter? Don't let another day pass where you accept less than what you're capable of. Don't let another week go by where you hide your talents because you're afraid of what people might think. Don't let another month slip away where you postpone your potential because the timing isn't perfect. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what's possible, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because every week we share stories of people who refuse to accept the limitations others placed on them, people who turned their pain into power and their struggles into strength. These aren't just entertainment. These are blueprints for transformation. And your transformation starts the moment you decide that your story isn't over. It's just beginning.